I have filled out a bracket for the women's tournament in the past, but I have never done a video bracket for the women's tournament. I have really been impressed with women's basketball this season, and I think that is the case for a lot of people. This year, I have watched more women's basketball than ever before, and I do like the current direction women's basketball is going right now. And I'm hoping that the momentum from this season carries on several years into the future. Without further ado, let's get to my predictions for the women's tournament. Starting with Regional 1, South Carolina, and the winner of a play-in game between 16 seeds. I will admit that I don't know anything about either of these teams, but what I do know is South Carolina is the number one overall seed for a reason. As I'm going with South Carolina, they will be without Camila Cardoso for the first game of this tournament, but I think South Carolina will be fine. I just think they're only going to win by 40 now instead of 70. North Carolina and Michigan State. I am going to go with the Spartans as the 8-9 matchups. It's always conflicting. Oklahoma and Florida Gulf Coast. I am aware that there aren't as many upsets in the women's tournament as there are the men's tournament, but I think that this one just screams upset. I think if this game goes exactly the direction I think it goes, I think Florida Gulf Coast pulls off the upset. Because I do think this is an ideal game where it could go down to the wire. As no matter if it's the men's tournament or the women's tournament or any tournament, when you're the underdog, all you have to do is just stay in the game from start to finish, and you have a really strong chance of pulling off an upset. Indiana and Fairfield. I'm going with Indiana just because I have more knowledge about Indiana than I do Fairfield. Nebraska and Texas A&M, and I admire the sense of humor that the tournament committees have by pairing up Nebraska and A&M both in the men's and women's tournaments, and it's all because of Trev Alberts. But I'm going to go with Nebraska, and I don't want to spoil anything, but I think Nebraska could be a sleeper to make it to the Elite Eight. I think this Nebraska team is just that good. They could make a run all the way to the Elite Eight. I think they have that kind of upside. Oregon State and Eastern Washington. I am going with Oregon State. Ole Miss and Marquette. I am going to go with Ole Miss. Notre Dame and Kent State. I've been really impressed with Notre Dame throughout the season. I'm going to go with the Irish to advance. And I'm going to go down to Regional 4. That way we're still doing this left to right. Texas and Drexel. I'm going with Texas. Alabama, Florida State. I'm going to go with the Seminoles. Utah and South Dakota State. I am very tempted to pick an upset here, but I just think that Utah is going to win this game. I'm really conflicted on it, but I'm going to pick Utah to move on. Gonzaga and UC Irvine. I'm going with Gonzaga. Tennessee and Green Bay. Green Bay, I believe, was on the bubble in the week and a half leading up to the selection show, but they made it in where they didn't have to play a playing game, which I'm sure that really did surprise some people, but I'm going to go with Tennessee. NC State and Chattanooga. I'm going with NC State. Iowa State and Maryland. And this one feels very conflicting, but I'm going to go with Iowa State. Maybe it's the recency bias that I watched them last, but I'm going to go with Iowa State. Stanford, Norfolk State. I am going with Stanford. Moving up to Regional 2 now, and it is Iowa against a winner of a play-in game. Again, I really don't know who these teams are, but one thing I do know is that Iowa is led by Caitlin Clark, and she has been in the news a lot this year even if you don't watch sports at all, there's a 95% chance you know who Caitlin Clark is. And Iowa is just one of the many teams that are looking for redemption after losing last year's championship game to LSU, who they are in this regional. So we could see this matchup play out in the Elite Eight. But I'm going with Iowa, West Virginia, and Princeton. I am going with West Virginia. Colorado and Drake. I am aware that Colorado, they had a dominant win opening night against LSU, the defending champions, but I was going to pick Colorado no matter what. Kansas State and Portland. I am going to go with Kansas State. Louisville and Middle Tennessee State. I'm going with Louisville. LSU and Rice. LSU, the defending champions. I'm going to go with LSU, and we will see Haley Van Lith go up against her former school in the second round. That is something that people are really anticipating and really wanting to see play out. As there are a lot of different storylines that can play out just in this regional. Creighton and UNLV. I am going with Creighton. UCLA and California Baptist. I am going with UCLA. Regional 3 to close out the round of 64. USC and Texas A&M Corpus Christi. I am going to go with USC. Kansas and Michigan, a very conflicting 8-9 as they all are, but I'm going to go with Michigan. Baylor and the winner of a playing game. I'm guessing this is Vanderbilt and Columbia, but I'm going to go with Baylor. Virginia Tech and Marshall. Going Virginia Tech. I will be really surprised if Virginia Tech loses this game. Syracuse and the winner of a playing game between, I'm guessing, Auburn, Arizona, based off of the abbreviations. And I feel like I need to pick some more upsets, even though I don't think this is going to happen. I'm going to go with the winner of the playing game between Auburn and Arizona. Just, I feel like I have to pick some upsets here. UConn and Jackson State, going with UConn. Duke and Richmond, I'm going with Duke. Ohio State and Maine, Ohio State. Moving on to the round of 32. South Carolina and Michigan State, going with South Carolina. Florida Gulf Coast and Indiana. I really want to pick Florida Gulf Coast, but I just think Indiana's going to take it. Nebraska and Oregon State. I'm going with the upset. I think Nebraska wins this matchup. Ole Miss and Notre Dame. I am going to go with, and I'm going to go with the upset. You know what? I feel like I got to have some fun with this. I'm going with Ole Miss. As much as I've been impressed with Notre Dame, this is just how I kind of see it playing out. I just have a feeling there's going to be one quadrant, one regional where there's going to be a little bit of chaos, and I think it could be here. Texas and Florida State. I'm going to go with Texas. Utah and Gonzaga. I'm going with Utah. Tennessee and NC State. I'm going with the upset. I'm going with Tennessee. Iowa State and Stanford. I'm going with Stanford. Iowa, West Virginia. I am going with Iowa. Colorado and Kansas State. I am going with Colorado. Louisville and LSU. I think a round of 32 matchup everybody wants to see. I'm going with LSU. Creighton and UCLA. I am going to go with UCLA. USC and Michigan. I'm going with USC. Baylor and Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech for me on this one. UConn versus the winner of this play-in game right here after beating Syracuse. I'm going with UConn. Duke and Ohio State. I'm going with Ohio State. And on to the Sweet 16. South Carolina and Indiana. I'm going with South Carolina to advance to the Elite Eight. Nebraska and Ole Miss. I'm going to go with Ole Miss. Although I would not be surprised if this was the matchup and Nebraska did win. But I am going with Ole Miss. Texas and Utah. I am going to go with Texas to advance to the Elite Eight. Tennessee and Stanford. I'm going to go with Stanford. Iowa and Colorado. I would not be surprised if Colorado shocked the world here, but I do expect Iowa to win. LSU and UCLA. I am going to go with LSU. USC, Virginia Tech. I am going to go with USC. UConn and Ohio State. I am going to go with UConn. And on to the Elite Eight. South Carolina, Ole Miss. I'm going with South Carolina to advance to the Final Four. Texas and Stanford. I'm going with Stanford. Iowa, LSU, a rematch of last year's national championship game. And I am going to go with LSU in this rematch. I think it's going to be a lot closer than what the championship game was last season. But I still think the Tigers prevail, advancing to the Final Four. USC and UConn. I am going to go with. I'm going to go with UConn. And my Final Four for this women's tournament: South Carolina, Stanford, LSU, and UConn. And I don't know if this just feels like a casual pick, but this is just how I see it playing out. South Carolina and Stanford. I feel like this would be the game where South Carolina would start to get into some trouble. But I'm going to go with South Carolina to advance to the championship game. LSU and UConn. I am going with LSU, which sets up the national championship game. South Carolina and LSU. And we saw these two teams in the SEC tournament, in the championship game. And we know what took place in that game. And I personally not be surprised if this indeed was set up by the committee to set up this matchup for the national championship game. But in that game, I was watching and it felt like LSU was staying in that game, but they had too many mental errors in that game. And I do think that if this matchup indeed did take place, I think it would be a very close game, but I'm going to go with South Carolina to win it all and maintain their perfect season. And I do feel like I will have some criticism by saying he did this entire thing just to pick South Carolina to win it all. But that is just how I see this tournament playing out. As I believe more than half the women's brackets have either South Carolina or Iowa winning the whole thing. But this is just how I see it playing out. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, take care.